The Bonaparte family is as confusing as any European royal family, which is to say, it's incredibly confusing. From the Habsburgs marrying their first cousins, to the Bourbons living so long that Louis XV, who succeeded Louis XIV, was actually his great-grandson, royal families quickly become a tangled mess, and the Bonapartes are no exception. Logic would have it that Napoleon III would be the grandson of Napoleon, or at least a direct descendant, but Napoleon III was the son of Napoleon's younger brother, and was also the grandson of Napoleon's first wife, but not Napoleon's grandson. So how did Napoleon III become the emperor out of 26 nieces and nephews who could have also been candidates? It really comes down to having the political initiative to run for office and realizing he could be elected president of France solely on his last name, and by also having the initiative to overthrow his own government and proclaim himself emperor. But suffice to say, Napoleon III being emperor gets even more confusing when you realize Napoleon I had direct descendants, who it would initially seem had a better claim than Napoleon III. The titular Napoleon II died at the age of 21 without any heirs, but in dramatic Napoleonic style, there were two others, who lived well into the reign of Napoleon III. This is where the story gets interesting, because common discussions about Napoleon usually never discuss children beyond his two marriages. Rarely mentioned are his two other sons, who had children of their own, unlike Napoleon II. In fact, those two sons have living descendants today, meaning that Napoleon has direct, living descendants. This is frankly incredible, since it is not common knowledge Napoleon had children who survived. So if they are not from his two marriages, where did they come from? After Napoleon discovered his wife Josephine was having affairs while he was campaigning in the late 1790s, he took that as tacit approval to have affairs of his own and took a mistress while on campaign in Egypt with one Pauline Blaise-Forêt. While this affair did not produce any children, some of his later ones did. His first child, Charles Léon, was with his mistress Eleanor de Nuit de Plan in 1806, and the young boy was later even acknowledged by Napoleon. Unfortunately for Empress Josephine, this child would spell her doom. Napoleon had been trying for children for years, being on the hunt for an heir for his empire. He took this as a sign that Josephine was the source of the infertility and not him. It subsequently led to the divorce of the imperial couple in 1810, despite Napoleon still loving her. For example, he gave her an enormous pension out of the treasury, and his last thoughts and words as he lay dying on St. Helena in 1821 were La France, l'armée, tête d'armée, Josephine. Napoleon's affairs and subsequent illegitimate offspring changed the trajectory of the empire, eventually leading Napoleon to marry his second wife, the Austrian princess. Napoleon's second child, Alexander Walewski, was born in 1810, a product of his affair with the Polish noblewoman Maria Walewski, while he was on campaign in what is now Poland. But Napoleon would break off this affair before he married his second wife, as he saw it as his duty to be faithful to his new young princess bride. Napoleon's third son, with his second wife, would not be born until March 1811. And while Napoleon II would die at the age of 21, Napoleon's two firstborn sons, Charles Léon and Alexander Walewski, would live to adulthood. It would have been understandable if they were never mentioned, because they never did anything successful or noteworthy in their lives. But while that is true for Charles, Alexander had an incredibly interesting career, making his historical absence quite strange. But let us start with the least interesting son for now. Napoleon's firstborn child, Charles Léon, received recognition for being the firstborn of the emperor and was treated as such for several years, rather than as an illegitimate child. According to Napoleon's valet of 14 years, the emperor tenderly loved his son. I often fetched him to him. He would caress and give him 100 delicacies, and was much amused with his vivacity and repartees, which were very witty for his age. Charles was provided an income of 30,000 francs from birth, and was given an education all at the expense of the empire. But when Napoleon's legitimate son to Marie-Louise, Napoleon II, was born, Charles Léon was mostly forgotten. It did not help Charles Léon's future that his father was, of course, eventually exiled permanently. Napoleon tried to provide for Charles Léon in his will by giving him 300,000 francs, but it was never given to him, as the new monarchy under Louis XVIII never carried out Napoleon's will. For Charles Léon, the search for money was not an uncommon one and would be the sad story of the rest of his life, as he became a habitual gambler and was constantly in debt. He eventually ended up in debtor's prison twice and killed a man in a duel over his gambling debts. He would later petition his cousin, the newly elected president of France, in 1849 for the 300,000 francs prescribed to him in the will. He was only convincing enough to receive 10,000 per year. This is how Charles Léon was remembered by his grandchild when she was interviewed by the New York Times in 1921 for the centennial of Napoleon's death, It is also worth recognizing that this granddaughter of Napoleon, 55 years old by this point, told the reporter her own son, at 19, the great-grandson of Napoleon I, had died fighting near Reims in the First World War. I mean, that's pretty crazy information, right? That's not just me. That Napoleon had a descendant who died fighting for France in the First World War? Charles Leon himself would die of a form of stomach cancer at the age of 74 in 1881, remarkably similar to his father and grandfather's deaths, which were also likely due to stomach cancer. Whereas Charles Leon lived in debt and obscurity most of his life, squandering the opportunity of being the son of one of Europe's greatest figures, his half-brother would not do the same. Alexander Walewski lived a life of surprising and impressive accomplishment compared to his brother Charles. While his brother's claim to fame may have just been the fact that he was born to the emperor, causing the divorce of Napoleon and Josephine, Walewski would have his own purposeful impact on the Third Empire. Being born to a Polish noblewoman and officially claimed by her husband as his son, hence the reason for his last name, DNA tests of Walewski's descendants have proved that he was in fact the offspring of the emperor. He did briefly meet his biological father, as he at least visited him on Elba during Napoleon's first exile in 1814. But he was largely raised in Poland, then occupied by the Russians after the collapse of the empire. He would eventually have to flee his home to Paris, as he was almost impressed into the Russian Imperial Army at 14. His time in France would be very good to him, as he would serve in the French Foreign Legion in Algeria, become a naturalized French citizen, serve in the regular army, and go on to receive the Legion of Honor. Walewski eventually rose to the rank of Grand Cross of the Legion, which is the highest and most prestigious out of the 5 ranks. It is not that far of a leap to say Walewski would have made his military-minded father proud by reaching the highest rank in the Legion of Honor, which Napoleon himself had established. Walewski resigned from his military commission at 27 in 1837 and became a writer in Paris. At this point, the connections he had made throughout the government helped him into the French Foreign Ministry and caused him to be sent on diplomatic missions as far afield as Argentina. By this time, his cousin Louis Napoleon had become president of the Second Republic, and Walewski, being a lot more diplomatic than his half-brother Leon, get it because he'd become a diplomat, managed to gain the favor of the new man in charge. President Bonaparte would send him to Florence and Naples as envoy extraordinaire and minister plenipotentiary, and then to London as the French ambassador in 1851. Walewski would actually be the one to inform the British Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Lord Palmerston, of President Bonaparte's overthrow of the Second Republic. As a continued sign of trust between now Emperor Napoleon III and his cousin Alexander Walewski, Walewski was named the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, essentially Secretary of State, and would head the French delegation at the Congress of Paris, which led to the Treaty of Paris that ended the Crimean War. Okay, please, just for the sake of all history students and just people everywhere, can we stop having treaties and congresses in Paris? There's like 40 of them. I'm just sick of it. I think we need a Treaty of Paris, saying no more treaties of Parises. His time as foreign minister was spent trying to uphold what was left of the Congress of Vienna after 1848, and keeping the peace between all the great European powers, as he saw that as the Second Empire's best hope for survival. After leaving the Foreign Office in 1860, he held various legislative roles in the empire, such as Minister of State, Member of the Senate, and President of the Corps Legislatif. Towards the end of his life, Walewski was actually aware of the threat posed by the rising power of Prussia, which would soon unite Germany. By 1866, he thought that war between France and Prussia was inevitable, and by 1868 was seemingly brought out of retirement by Napoleon III to try and plan diplomatically for this outcome by visiting Bavaria and Württemberg and convincing them to stay neutral in a future conflict. There's some doubt about what exactly was being planned by the Emperor and Walewski, because Walewski suddenly died at the age of 58, leaving those diplomatic plans unfinished. Thus, the life of one of the Second Empire's most seasoned diplomats was cut short 3 years before one of France's worst ever diplomatic debacles, resulting in the collapse of the Second Empire. While his father was one of the greatest warriors of all time, Walewski was almost the inverse, an accomplished diplomat, and compared to his half-brother, there's almost no comparison at all. It shows the two different paths two brothers of an extremely intelligent father can take. Besides their stories being interesting in their own right, what makes these two men especially intriguing is they currently have living descendants. I was only able to find a significant amount about the Walewskis, but I have seen repeated references to Charles Leon also having living relatives. Just as an example, some of Alexander Walewski's descendants still run a company founded by imperial decree in 1853 under the Second Empire, which has been in family hands ever since. The shipping company Twax? I have no idea. Is currently run by the two brothers, Fabrice and Raphael Walewski. So there is a 168-year-old, multi-billion-dollar French industrial shipping company run by the descendants of Napoleon Bonaparte. Do with that information what you will. The other interesting thing these two sons leave us is photographs. Their father Napoleon is infamous for being recognizable in portraits, but each portrait is different enough so that it's hard to get a sense of what Napoleon really looked like. In addition, he also had artists tamper with his image for propagandistic effects, leaving us an even less accurate image of the famous general. But his sons left us photographs. The photos of Alexander Walewski are very clear, and you can actually kind of see the resemblance to the portraits we do have of Napoleon. It's not that far of a leap to say you could see him being the son of the emperor. I think he has his dad's nose. In celebration of actually getting to 150 subscribers, I thought I'd actually do a Q&A, so if you want to leave any questions down below, feel free.